All right, welcome to Level 1C Notes. That is all about greatest common factor. So if you look, we got each individual piece, greatest common factor. And the way we abbreviate that is G for greatest, C for common, and F for factor. So GCF is what we call that for short instead of saying greatest common factor all the time. And all these words individually are really, when they're put together, make a lot of sense to help with this. So we've already talked about factors, and factors are the numbers we multiply together to get a number. So for example, like 2 and 3 are factors of 6 because 2 times 3 is 6. So these are numbers that we multiply together. The word common tells us that they have to have, they're two different numbers that have to have the same factor, so common factor. Okay, so that's where we're getting those from, is common factor. They have a factor in common, two different numbers that we're looking at. But greatest common factor means that it's the biggest number that the two numbers have in common where it's their factor. Okay, so the trick to solving GCF is what we call the division ladder. And if you want to write that, you can. I know my handwriting's a little big on here. Okay, but it's called the division ladder, so it's kind of like an upside down division. So let's try this with our practice problem right here and find the GCF of 20 and 40. So remember, GCF is the greatest common factor. So I'm going to write my 20 and 40 over here. And to start the division ladder, okay, it's like an upside down long division sign. You might call it like a layer to your cake, or however you want to think of it. It doesn't really matter. But what this is allowing us to do is look at these two numbers, 20 and 40, and try and think what is a factor that they have in common. So basically, what's a number you could divide both of those numbers by? So I know they're both even numbers, so I'm going to start with 2. And so I write that 2 on the outside here. And then I'm answering that question of 20 divided by 2 gives me 10 left over, and I'm writing it down here because that's what I have left. So I started with 20, but after I pulled out this 2, after I divided by this 2, I'm left with this 10. So then I have to do the same thing to my other number, my 40. So 40 divided by 2 is going to be 20. So now I'm looking at these two numbers. I'll switch colors. Now I'm looking at these two numbers, because after I take that 2 out, now that's what I have left. And so I need to ask myself if there's any more factors that these two numbers now have in common. And when I look at 10 and 20, I know they both end in a 0, so there's a 10 in common. Now maybe I could have realized that sooner, because if you look, here's a 0 and a 0 here, so I could have started with 10, I suppose. Doesn't really matter. I start with 2, and that's okay. I can always add another layer to my division ladder, so this is kind of like the next ring in the ladder. And I'm going to take out a 10, because I know that goes into 10 and 20. So 10 divided by 10 gives me 1, and 20 divided by 10 gives me 2. So now when I look at 1 and 2, I don't have any more common factors other than 1, but that's going to be for any number. So I can't divide 1 and 2 any smaller. So here's how I would find my greatest common factor. I look at these numbers that I pulled out over here, the 2 and the 10. And here's kind of a nifty trick. Let me see if that'll work. What you can do to help remember is if you look at these two numbers, I got some pretty colors going on, and if I draw a G around them, what I'm going to do is multiply 2 times 10 to get 20, and so that is my GCF. Because if I look at 20 and 40, okay, I can divide them both by 20, and really I could have seen that right away possibly, and maybe 20 is what you started with. That's okay. You can start with whatever number you see that goes into both of those numbers. So if I take 20 and divide it by 20, I end up with this 1 down here. If I take 40 and divide it by 20, I end up with 2. So I still end up with that 1 and 2, however I approach this, and I end up with 20 as the biggest factor, so the greatest factor that 20 and 40 have in common. So that is my GCF for those two numbers, is 20. Okay, so you could have done that work with me over here. So that means 20 is their greatest factor in common. You can just put GCF for that. What does this number mean? It's their greatest common factor. Okay, now you have some practice to try on the next page. Feel free to use this division ladder method. If you need a little bit more practice or need to go back and look at this video again, feel free. But otherwise, go ahead and give it a try. And good luck.